So this is Lee Janzen. Janzen?
Janzen.
Janzen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know Lee because Lee was my midwife in my last birth with Jody, and she's also one of the midwives I'm working with in this pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
But also just we stayed friends because I think that when you have a really strong birth experience, it's hard not to be connected to the person who delivers your baby or helps.
And vice versa, like for us to not have that relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hard to say goodbye.
It's impossible,
It
really.
is, yeah, for sure.
So, so Lee, I know you're a midwife, but I don't actually know how long you've been a midwife for.
Good question. So I did my training in Ireland. So I went to Ireland, I can't remember what year that was now, but I did my training and graduated in 2012. At Trinity College in Dublin. And then I came back to Canada after that, just because of the model in Ireland. It's much more, it's all in the hospital. There's not really the continuity of care. You can have a private midwife, but they come up against a lot of issues just with if they have to transfer their clients, there's not that continuity to the hospital. They can't stay with their clients. So I didn't love that model.
Okay.
So I did my training there, came back here and waited the bridging program at the time. The funding had been cut for that. So then I had to just sort of wait. So I actually just started building relationship with the midwives and people in the community. I helped second attend at Homebirths. I did some doula work.
Awesome.
So I just sort of got involved with birth to some extent. Yeah.
And that was specifically in Kamloops?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Because we had moved here my husband got work in Kamloops. And so that's how we ended up here.
Was he in Ireland with you as well?
He was, yeah. We were there 8.5 years.
Wow. And
so a long time.
Is he from Ireland?
No. He's from Canada.
Okay.
I was born in Zimbabwe. I suppose I should start there.
Yeah. I was
born in Zimbabwe and I grew up there and then came to university in Canada. So that's how we met at university. And then over time, and maybe this leads into the other question, so maybe I'll leave that for a second. But over time, I realized how much I wanted to do midwifery. And so that's how we ended up going to Ireland, because at the time, midwifery was just beginning here in BC. And so the chances of me getting in were not super high, and I really wanted to do it. But it ended up being a long process anyway, but it's just the way it went.
So then you guys went to Ireland for you to go to school?
For me to do midwifery.
Wow. So you've been really motivated to be in this profession.
For a while, yes.
Yes. And so what drew your passion for it?
So I had originally, when I first started, I did a Bachelor of Science in biology, and with the whole goal of sort of going into medicine, pre-medicine and doing pediatric medicine. But as I was doing it, first of all, I realized how much schooling that involved and how much that would cost. So I was like, maybe not. And it really, when I thought about it, and the more I kind of was exposed to different professions or different kind of ideas of careers, I realized that actually wasn't what I wanted. I was more like community health that I was interested in. So, and then particularly women's health, like promoting health in a community. So public health, I suppose, would be sort of what I was leaning more towards when I thought about it more.
Right.
And then somebody came to talk, when I was at university, somebody came to talk about their midwifery program in the Philippines. And it just it was like this light bulb, people talk about light bulb moment, but it literally was. I listened to this, I'm like, that's exactly what I want, right? Because it was about health and normality and promoting that and being involved in these, amazing moments in people's lives.
Yes.
And being, promoting health in those environments, and generally as a community, like community health generally.
And there's a piece of activism, and we'll talk about this, but I think in midwifery, and you say in promoting health, there is a piece of activism in that, especially when it comes to women's health. So being a midwife, even if it's just health promotion, you end up being an activist by default.
Oh, definitely.
Yes.
Oh, definitely. I think the whole profession is like that.
Yeah.
Because you're actively pursuing health for women and their families and communities as a result, right? Like it just sort of trickles out from there, or what's the word I'm looking for? Like a wave.
Yeah. Totally. It just expands and it has massive impacts on a community. Yeah. And I think about that because living in Kamloops, I'm originally from Manitoba. And the access to midwifery care here and home birthing and such in Kamloops is very different than what is offered in my hometown.
Yes.
And, then I think about how that is a common conversation in our community here in Kamloops amongst mothers and women, that midwifery is just more of an normalized option here, even though it's not totally normalized, but it's more normalized than it is where I'm from.
Yes.
Like, it's like, wow, you had a home birth. It's like really shocking for some people. But in Kamloops, it doesn't seem to be that shocking because there's so many women that have had that opportunity.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. I mean, we certainly need more midwives for the amount of women that want a midwife.
Yes.
We certainly need that more. But you're right. There is it's more of a normal choice or option. There's still lots of lack of knowledge about what midwifery care is, and people even knowing, whether that's a safe option or not. So we still are, educating people about what midwifery care is, but you're right, it's definitely more sort of known, and people are a bit more comfortable here in BC.
Yes.
And in Kamloops specifically with midwifery care.
What do you think is the biggest misconception that you get around midwifery care?
I think probably the biggest, I don't know if it's the biggest misconception, but
or a common one.
A very common one would be, people just don't know whether a midwife actually helps them at their birth. Oh. It's really surprising. Like, they'll apply for midwifery care, but maybe I've had quite a few people not understand that the doctor is not going to be there. Like, that we're the primary care providers in like a low risk healthy pregnancy. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. So they think that it's more like building that relationship and that you'd be working alongside a doctor?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And is that is a model for some places? Or not really?
No, not usually. I mean, in Ireland, it would have been, we would have worked in the hospital a bit like obstetric nurses, but also would have done the actual births. And then, if we needed to consult an obstetrician or pediatrician, then we could.
Okay.
But there was always the obstetrician involved, or a pediatrician involved in writing orders and things like that. Okay. So it's quite different here. We have a bit more autonomy here.
And so how does it work here if you were to say, I know it's different versus home birth in the hospital, but...
You mean in terms of, like, if we needed to consult somebody else?
Yes.
Then we would. Like, so we have a guideline by our college that tells us when we need to have another discussion with another healthcare professional, or when we need to consult, like certain situations, we would consult. Or in some cases, we would need to transfer care altogether. If there's more, we're talking more obvious medical concerns, heart defect, heart disease, or things like that. Okay. That's not really in the midwife's remit to take care of. But in some cases, we can provide supportive care as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Then an obstetrician and a midwife are involved.
I see. That's the case.
So it just depends on the situation. So we always would have that conversation with our clients about which would be the best, to suggest, okay, let's do a consult here. Are you okay with that? Yeah.
One of the things that I've personally just loved so much about midwifery care is the constant consultation about the care. It's like, well, what do you prefer? And here's the knowledge, and here's the options, and here's what's recommended, or,
totally.
But then when it comes down to it, just always feels like it's a choice, and maybe it's supposed to be a choice.
It is
the other way. I mean, I've been so privileged to only have this type of care. But it feels like a lot of decisions are put in my court as we go along through pregnancy, which I appreciate.
Well, I think, if you just generally, pregnancy is a healthy, normal part of life. So the way and it's a really important part of our care as midwives, is that you're involved in the decision making, because it's your pregnancy, it's your family. So, your family is involved in that decision. So it's a team effort. And that's where that relationship building is so key.
Yes.
So we try to build relationships with our clients so that they feel that they can trust us, and that we can understand what their needs are and what their preferences are. And that builds safety into the care.
It does. And
safety into the whole outcomes.
And when you're talking, I just think about, my counselor brain goes on, and I think about trauma and, what happens for what I've seen in the counseling room is when women experience birth trauma, it's because there wasn't a choice. It's not about it being medically intervened with, right? Because sometimes medical intervention is absolutely necessary.
That's right.
And as a woman, you're going to choose that.
Correct.
Right? Because it's the healthiest thing for you and your baby. But it's like not getting the information usually, or not getting the choice.
Yeah. Just having something done to you versus
that's right.
saying, this is why we need to do this. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, exactly. And so then, then I think about what happens in midwifery care, that relationship that you're talking about, and that safety. I mean, when it comes to birthing, safety is like number one. It's primal. Right? Like safety on a nervous system level.
All the levels.
Yes.
And, like we were just talking before we even started this, there was a Cochrane review, 2016, I think, a few years ago anyway, where they looked at midwifery-led care and the outcomes from midwifery-led care, and they are improved on many levels. And a lot of that has to do with that relationship between a midwife and her client.
And so improved in the way, Lee, as in like birth outcomes?
Yeah. So they specifically looked at a few, they didn't look at everything, but they selected, I think it was like 15 studies or something, and looked at various outcomes in all of these studies. So they obviously need to pick things that are across the board on all those studies. So they didn't look at everything, but the few things that they did find was that I think it was reduced preterm birth, reduced loss of a baby, reduce like intervention, like for like an assisted birth, like like forceps or vacuum birth, and reduce risk, I think, of episiotomy. So a few reduced use of epidural actually.
Okay.
And we know that. I mean, we know that support is a huge part of pain management or perception of pain.
Yes.
So having good support is really key in that regard. The one thing that they did find, though, is that labors were half an hour longer with midwives. So some people might find that a deal breaker.
What do you think that's about?
Well, I think they're just willing to wait.
I think so too.
Yeah, just willing to sort of wait and see and trust the process.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
That's a really beautiful part of midwifery care, at least from my experience, because with Joni, as you know, you can so many times before that baby came.
Yes.
It's like I thought I was in labor for so long, and I've thought about if I didn't have a midwife, I feel like I would have been induced.
Yes.
Because I was so, I was nervous about what was happening and I didn't know, and I was uncomfortable. I just feel like if I had a doctor or a OB, they'd be like, okay, let's just sweep you, or, let's induce
or
you.
Even if that didn't happen, maybe you wouldn't trust the process as much, and you would be a lot more anxious.
Absolutely.
Right? Than somebody going, no, this is okay. This is normal. Your baby's healthy. You're doing fine. Right.
And this is normal for some women, and some women do this. And
And looking at the whole, not just the physical part of it, right? It's as you know, I won't tell your story, but like the emotional and mental aspect of it is so key, and often that gets kind of pushed out of the way. I
think it more than often gets pushed out of the way.
I know. Yeah. Which is just too bad.
That emotional prep. And so it's remarkable to me, the difference in care. And I think women need to choose where they feel safe.
Yes.
Right. Because I do think safety is important. But I think from my experience, a misconception around midwifery is that it is riskier, right? Where you're sharing that the outcomes are actually suggest otherwise.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But that, even my mom, I love her dearly, but she comes from a different generation, right? And she's like, oh, so like the midwife checks your blood pressure? I'm like, Mom, what do you
Yeah.
What do you think they do?
I would have to say that generation does tend to have a little bit more doubt as to our professionalism, right? And our skills.
And what you're doing. And I often say to people, like, the reason why I feel so secure with midwifery care is that this is a person who's gone to school specifically for this.
That's right.
One thing for many years.
That's all we do.
This isn't just like a course.
That's right.
In like, a whole schooling. This is like
a 4-year degree. Yes. Specifically for midwifery. And this is where I think there's some misconception as well. And I think we naturally feel like for any medical condition, we want the expert. We want the best person to care for that. And a lot of people assume that that's the obstetrician in maternity setting. And that's not necessarily the case. They're definitely necessary for if there's a medical concern in a pregnancy, absolutely, you want an obstetrician involved. Yes. But for normal, low-risk, healthy pregnancies, midwives are actually the experts. And, we see this in all the research. Yeah. So educating people is really key. And building that, confidence in that particular choice is important.
Well, you see it show up in the demand now for midwifery, right? So once women have had a midwife, I think that's obviously impetus to have it again.
Yes.
And then I know that once you have a friend that's had a midwife and you get to hear about the care and the option, that then more women want midwifery care.
Right. Yeah. And we're seeing more medical doctors also coming into midwifery care, or lots of nurses, lots of nurse practitioners. So they obviously, which is always encouraging to us, because I'm like, they obviously then recognize the value of midwifery.
Like coming care. As clients, you mean? Yeah.
It's lovely when that happens.
Yes.
Because they get to experience it as well, because they obviously recognize that value, like I said, which is always quite validating for us.
I'm sure it is, especially if they've been working in the hospital and get to see, because midwives also work in the hospital, which is an important piece too, right? It's not just home birth. And so they can witness you guys doing your work.
Yes.
When you have a client that births in the hospital.
Yeah.
Have things been, I know they've probably been so different with COVID. Have you guys seen an increase in home births or?
Not as much as I expected, actually.
Okay.
I mean, certainly I think I would probably say we've had more interest in home birth.
Yeah.
And people saying, I'd like to plan it if things are really bad in the province, or, that there's an outbreak at the hospital, then they'd be much more open to home birth. Which is always it's a good conversation to have with people. It's like, you need to want to plan a home birth because you want to plan a home birth, not because there's a pandemic. I mean, I definitely understand. I totally understand that, not wanting to be in the hospital. But somebody needs to feel safe in their choice and secure in their decision that they've want a home birth. So we definitely have a good conversation about that. So to answer your question, I can't say that we in our practice have noticed a big change. I don't know if maybe other midwives have.
Yeah. Well, I guess I totally hear what you're saying, because I've had people I know are clients that have said like, I wanted to have a home birth because of COVID, but you're right. It's like, it has to be, having had a home birth, it's you have to commit to that.
That's right. Yeah.
Like, you have to different experience.
Yeah. You have to be secure in that decision. And, we know the research is very clear that with a low risk, healthy pregnancy, that home birth is as safe as the hospital. So we'd certainly discuss that information with clients so that they know that information in making their decision. But we've certainly had people who've said, if it's bad at the hospital, but we'd rather at the hospital, birth at the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some people just feel safer there. I often think, I'm so sensitive, and I say this to people, I would have a hard time birthing in a hospital. And that's not because I feel unsafe in a hospispital, but it's because I'm highly sensitive, and there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of different people at the hospital, even if you're in your own room. Like I know myself enough that, if I have to transfer, of course, but it's not my first choice because I know how sensitive I am.
Yeah.
So, but for some women, it would feel more difficult to birth at home.
Yeah. And that's why we when somebody's interested, we always talk about that option of home birth, because that is the choice that we give as midwives, because we can do birth at home and at the hospital. And we, pretty interchangeable in that regard. So we always talk about, like I said, the research on the safety of home birth, but also talking about, okay, you need to understand what, that you feel comfortable, that your partner feels comfortable, because if any one of you is not comfortable being home, if that's, causing anxiety, that's going to really affect your labor, right? We know like emotions and hormones are such an integral part of labor. If somebody's stressed out in their decision of being at home or the hospital, for example,
it probably has a massive impact.
Switch. It does. Oh, it totally does. Yeah.
And so you see that, obviously, right? When you go into a birthing situation.
Usually by the time we get to term, like when somebody gets to 37 weeks or more, usually by then the decision is fairly solid in their minds as to what they're most comfortable with, because we have those conversations throughout the pregnancy. If somebody's not sure, we'll have more of those conversations and more information and, you know, answer their partner's questions. It's often the partner that's not keen. Yeah. Actually.
Yeah. I'm not surprised about that.
Answering the questions of, you know, what are they afraid of? What are they concerned about? And talking through all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a big commitment. It's a big commitment. And with the stigma around it too, right?
Absolutely.
That's a big part of it. And people, again, thinking that it's not it's a riskier option.
That's right. And I think that's a huge misperception of home birth. So we do try to educate people on the research on that, on home birth being safe. Yeah.
And the more I think that people talk about their home births and make that, you know, more in our cultural landscape, that people will start to see, because, you know, I think, and you can speak to this more, Lee, but I'm sure that there was just a big pendulum swing. Like most women birthed at home.
Yes.
And then it was like hospital, and now we're...
Yes. I mean, historically, it was a community thing, right? Like all the women would go and gather and help this woman labor and birth. Was the community midwife. You know, I actually watch Call the Midwife.
Do you? I was going to ask you that.
I read the book, like, I think when I did my training, I read the book and I loved it. And then the series came out, and I do watch it. I really enjoy it. I'm like, there's something really appealing about being a midwife on a bike, going around to the neighbors and helping them have their babies. So that's where midwifery would have started, is very much in the community. You know, somebody would come running to call the midwife, and off you'd go, and you'd help that woman, and you'd trade chicken, or, you know, you'd get a chicken for your services or whatever, right? There's something lovely about that. But then it sort of became more risky, and it became much safer to go to a hospital. In fact, where I trained in Ireland was one of the first they called them lying in hospitals in Europe. You know, which they brag about and say is such a great thing. But over time, I was like, I don't know if that was, because it actually drew people out of their communities.
Oh, interesting.
And we see that effect now, I think, anyway, in families just not being connected to community in their whole sort of birthing experience.
So the lying in hospital, is that like hospital beds? Is that what?
Lying in. So you would, like, when you were laboring, you would go to the hospital, you would have your baby, you would stay at the hospital for however long. It used to be much longer than it is now, and then go back home to your family. Yeah.
So there's the first hospital that happened at.
Yeah. One of the first.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a lovely old building and hospital. But yeah, so they took birth out of community, isolated a woman in the hospital, and basically dictated how she was to have a birth. There was even a horrible period of time, in my opinion, where, have you heard of twilight sleep?
I have, but
women would be essentially drugged when they're in labor and wake up to having had their baby, having birthed their baby. And often, you know, that would be forceps birth or something like that, just because they weren't present. So I can't even imagine how that would feel to be completely not present.
I can't even imagine.
At your birth. I mean, certainly some people do experience that with, you know, general anesthetic cesarean sections, but it's very rare.
And it's necessary usually, right?
Like, that's correct. Yes.
It's like we have to do this because and it's not just versus like standard practice.
Yeah, this is the standard practice where, and their whole perspective was that they were helping, you know, women not suffer.
Yes.
Which is just, taking that control from women and that power away from women. I'm sure that affected them significantly.
Oh, I'm just thinking, you know, one of this is my own soapbox, but since having my first birth, I've become very passionate about birth, and it as a process of empowerment for women.
Yes.
And I do think that by telling women that birth is scary, and this cultural idea that we should be fearful of the pain of birth and we should be fearful of birth itself is one of the ways that women are oppressed the most.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, because it's,
then they hand themselves over to whoever will help with that. Yeah.
Right.
You know, or whatever.
And feeling disempowered in that situation and fearful, when I think birth, no matter how it works out, whether that's a cesarean or whether that's natural birth, whatever, has the possibility to show you how strong you really are as a woman, right? And making these decisions and going with the flow, letting go of expectations. Like there's a lot of possibility there in this process, transitioning to motherhood, to really grow and have a new type of confidence in yourself. But when that's taken away from you, that's when it gets really traumatic.
Significant effects for sure. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's a large part of why I love midwifery. You know, a lot of people talk about, oh, you've got such a great job snuggling babies. I'm like, well, yeah, but actually it's a lot more about women and seeing them grow into these powerful, loving, deeply loving women, and so many more aspects, right? Becoming these parents and this, you know, growing a family. Like there's something quite amazing about it, and something I don't often talk about, but it affects us as midwives too, right? We talk about how it affects women having these powerful births, despite, you know, no matter how it happens, like you said, like whether it's by cesarean or by vaginal birth, however that it happens outcome wise, if somebody feels supported and empowered, that's so encouraging to us. Yeah. It's, you know, soul satisfying.
So I was going to say, is it really inspiring?
It is. It's incredibly soul satisfying. It's very hard. Like when you get a series of births that are just really tough, sometimes that can be really soul destroying. You know, if there's lots of people that are traumatized, we take that quite personally. I do as a midwife. I struggle with that myself in taking that on as a personal thing, because I have such a relationship with our clients, right?
Well, you know, Lee, I think about birth. Well, you know, if you asked him, he'll say women get high at birth.
It's true.
Yeah. You know, and he jokes about it because he was there and there was, you know, 4 people at Joni's birth. Yeah. And he just says, like, if you look at women in a birthing room, like there's something that happens there
it's so
you can't even put words to. And maybe we'll talk about this more, but there's something very spiritual in my experience about birth. Obviously, I mean, even if you don't identify as a spiritual person, you can't deny, like, you're bringing a baby into the world.
Bringing life into the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
So to not enmesh with a client's experience, like when someone is really struggling or things don't work out in the way that they had hoped for, or they have a traumatic birth, it would be very difficult as a midwife to not be impacted by that.
Yeah.
You know, just based on how intimate that experience is.
Definitely.
Yeah. You guys have a really big job.
Yeah. And, you know, it is amazing. Like, even if somebody does have, you know, more of a traumatic birth and struggles, to be there for that. As a midwife too, you have that relationship after the fact as well.
Right.
For at least a period of time, can certainly be rewarding. But yes, those births where it's very obviously empowering and deeply spiritual and growth, you can see growth happening in somebody. It's amazing.
It feels
and
inspiring. For the other ones.
Yes. Yeah. It just like fills me up. Yeah.
So that leads me to my next question is, do you have a birth experience that felt particularly inspiring for you, like as a midwife?
I don't, there's several, I mean, there's always, you know, birth. Yours would be one of my favorite birth stories in so many ways. I won't tell you a birth story, but it was, I think when you see somebody going to the depths of themselves and rising out of that in, you know, just a more powerful whole person. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's amazing to watch that and to be part of that, to have been involved in that happening is pretty, it's very inspiring.
Yeah, it makes me want to cry.
Incredible.
Sorry. Very pregnant. No, it's beautiful. And
I'm just, as I'm talking, I'm just remembering it. I'm like, it was amazing. And I certainly have other birth stories like that, you know, where there's just something amazing, something really special that comes out of it. Yeah.
You know, and I think, and I don't mind sharing pieces about my birth at all, but I think for me, that my birth was so beautiful. That's, I can really say that.
Yeah.
And difficult. I remember looking, I didn't say a lot. I mean, my perception might be different than yours, but I feel like I didn't say much during my birth.
No.
I was pretty quiet.
No.
I made noise, obviously.
Yeah.
But one of the things I said to you, I looked at you and I said, this isn't happening fast enough. Do you remember that?
I don't.
I remember.
Not specifically, no.
And you looked at me and you were like, you're doing great.
Yeah.
And then afterwards you told me it took a lot for me not to giggle at you because my birth was happening pretty fast.
Yes, that's right. It was. That's why I'm like, did you say that? I don't remember.
Like, this isn't happening fast enough. At least, maybe I didn't verbalize it, but in my head, I was just thinking
what you
like,
perceived what it should be.
Right. I was like, this isn't happening fast enough, but it was happening quite fast.
It was. Yes, that's correct.
Yes. And then I there was a moment in that experience where I actually went into an ecstatic state, or like very, maybe euphoric is probably the word to say in my transition between, I guess, active labor and pushing. I think, is that called the transition?
Transition. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember having an experience of immense, like, pain relief and total euphoria, and thinking, holy shit, what is happening?
This is good.
This is good. And it was, I don't know how long it was, but it felt like a really good break. Might have been 10 seconds. It could have been a minute. Who knows? Yeah. And being able to be present enough to fully experience that was one of my biggest gifts in that birth.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so lovely.
But I think the fact that I did hypnobirthing, and I didn't do it super strictly.
Yeah, but just to be more aware and present with this, with what's going on. Yeah.
Yes.
And that we often as midwives talk about, don't disturb the birthing women. And that's it's sometimes difficult to do, to really stand back or sit on your hands and just let it happen, because all the hormones that you're experiencing will affect how your labor progresses and how you experience your birthing experience. And so if we disturb that, we don't know how we're disturbing like what's actually naturally going on in your body, right? Yeah. Or getting your mind elsewhere, whereas it should be sort of focused on what's happening internally.
Yeah, you go into like it's like, I'm just going to use the word trance, but you go into like a totally different space as a birthing woman where you're, I don't know, it's hard to explain.
It is.
It's like you don't know time, you don't know,
right?
And so having any sort of disturbance, like I remember the dryer beeping,
right, in
my birth, and I got mad. I think
because you are sensitive to a lot of things. I mean, some women are able to just tune everything out.
Yeah,
but for the most part, people can be pretty sensitive in labor to everything that happens. I can certainly think of a few births where I could tell like the client was hypersensitive to any little change. Like she would like just turn, and I'm like, how can I create an environment where she doesn't need to feel like she needs to pay attention to everything?
Okay.
And that's really key, just kind of darkening the room, keeping the noise down, or having some music playing that's maybe helpful for her. Those kinds of things can be helpful for those kind of clients.
Oh yeah, and I think that part of the prep that we can do as women birthing is, and you can never really prepare.
No, true enough,
right?
True enough.
But to know, like, I know I'm sensitive, and that became very clear with all the early labor stuff I was going through, how sensitive I was and how my emotional state impacted my ability to move into birth, right? And
yes,
my avoidance of discomfort.
I remember those conversations.
I'll tell the funny part. I think that was like your third visit to the house. At that point, I was like, I have quite a few, over the 3 weeks. It was like, I think I'm in labor, and you came and everything stopped because this is what happened, right? It's like no more cramps or what I thought were contractions. Yeah. And I think I like ran back from the bathroom or something.
Yes. This I remember clearly. Yes.
And you were like, oh, what's going on? Yeah. And I was like, oh, I stopped drinking water because it hurts to sit on the toilet and pee.
Yeah. I remember that just like clicked in my brain. I'm like, Deandra, so you actually want contractions in order to go into labor. And
it also didn't even click for me what I was doing, right? And it was like, I'm laughing so hard because I remember that moment being like, oh shit.
Yes, I'm avoiding.
Right. I'm avoiding.
Yes.
And then we had a really good conversation where I was like, oh, I've done this before. I need to step into this. And it's part of the hypnobirthing education is like rest.
Yes.
Right? Rest.
Yes.
When you have these things, lay down and sleep. Well, I've been fucking resting for 3 weeks.
Yes.
And then at this point, I'm like, oh yeah, it's uncomfortable when I'm on the toilet. I'm just going to run back and lay on the bed.
That's right.
And then the look on your face, you were like, okay, so I'm going to leave and I want you to sit on the toilet.
That's
and I was
right.
like, okay. And literally you left and I sat on the toilet and my labor started.
Yeah, it wasn't long after that you went into active labor.
I think you arrived like 3 hours later.
That's right.
It was like 8:30 in the morning. And then you were there at like 1. And I was like 8 centimeters dilated. So I just like, boom, went into labor.
And that's a classic example too, just about that sort of mental and emotional connection to labor. Right?
Yes.
And I don't think it was that you didn't want to have labor. I mean,
no. I was anxious. I wanted to have it, but
that's
it was,
right.
I couldn't see it was a blind spot of how I was avoiding the discomfort. You know, it's like in my cognitive mind, I was like, oh yeah, I want to go into labor and I'm preparing. But then it was like anytime I had a physical sensation.
There was something that was saying, no, I don't want to do this. Yeah. And oftentimes as midwives, we have to address those, right? Those kinds of things and that's where that relationship is so key. Yes. If you don't have the relationship, it's hard to do that, I think.
Yes.
To
be strong in those moments and be like, you have to go there, you know, and trust that you can do it.
That's right.
Oh man, that was really funny for me. And I've used that a lot in my life since about that kind of unconscious avoidance and how that showed up in my labor.
Yeah.
But then also I wanted to share this part of it too, is I had read Ina May's Guide to Midwifery. Is that what
Guide
it is?
to Childbirth.
Thank you. Not spiritual midwifery. It's the
other one. Yeah.
And I had read all the stories. And I remember when I was in that early part of labor after you left, when I had a contraction come, I was like throwing up and, you know, having bowel movements at the same time, which was super scary for me as a woman, as a birthing woman, because I was like, oh my God, this is
my body's falling apart.
Yeah. And I'm going to get dehydrated. Or I started going into like, this is, you know, this can't be right. And then I remembered reading a birth story from that book where a woman did the same thing. And only one of the birth stories in that book did the woman also contract that way or have that experience in early labor. And that was a saving grace for me because I could have gone
normalized
into fear
it for you.
Yeah. And I was like, nope, this is how my body's preparing. Some women's bodies do this.
Oh, neat. I didn't know that actually.
Yeah. And that was really
helpful. I think stories are really key. And people talking about their birth stories or birth stories that they've heard, you know, just kind of having those conversations because it is a different experience for everybody and for every baby. You know, it doesn't, you know, because of how it went with Joni doesn't mean that's going to be how it goes this time, right? And this is where we spend a lot of time as midwives normalizing things, saying, no, this is really good. This is normal. This is part of the process.
Yeah.
But if we had more stories, maybe that would just become something that's known. Oh, this is something that happens.
Yeah, for some women, they labor this way.
Yeah. So, you know, maybe this is okay. I mean, certainly there's certain situations that you want to contact your midwife about if there's concerns. But for the most part, a lot of it is normal. We just don't necessarily know that. Which
is so nice when you have midwifery care to have that normalization. And I think just based on having friends that haven't used midwifery care and then versus the care that I've had, I've definitely been way more normalized in certain situations than maybe they have been or haven't even received the care, right? Because, you know, when I come in for a midwifery appointment, I get almost an hour every time. And that feels like a lot of time. And I don't think that people get that amount of time. No.
5 minutes, 10 minutes tops. Yeah.
So I can ask the questions and say like, this is happening. Okay, that's normal. And you know, you prep, I suspect this is part of your care, but you prep women for the realization that every labor is unique.
Oh, definitely.
That it's not this like, oh, you're going to lose your mucus plug and then you're going to lose your...
This is we do talk about the textbook, like this is kind of the normal textbook progress, but that's not always, like when I talk about when to page us in labor, I'll always kind of give the guideline as to what, when your contractions are this many minutes apart, lasting this long, and this has been happening for an hour or two. I always say this is just a guideline. Yeah. This is not like every woman is different in how they start labor and go into active labor. So this is just a guideline.
Yeah. And that's why
I say that several times.
You do.
Just a guideline.
It's just a guideline. So, and that's the work. I think that's the work. And that's what the beauty of midwifery care is, like letting go of your expectation and you can't control the process, and having a midwife that continues to say, we just have to go with what comes up. Yeah. And if it's healthy, then we're okay.
Yeah. And, like that presentation I was talking earlier about the fear of childbirth.
Yes.
She was talking as well about, birth is not certain. We know this about birth. There's lots of uncertainty in birth, but that doesn't mean that we need to look at that negatively. And so to start reframing that uncertainty to being, okay, I'm going to be as prepared as I can be, with being educated, investing in becoming strong and healthy as a birthing person. I'm going to do all those things to prepare as much as I can, but these uncertainties come up, and that can be just part of my personal progress in labor, my personal journey to meeting my baby. Or becoming a parent, or,
And that's the emotional spiritual work,
yes,
I think,
Definitely.
And there's a book, I know I shared it with you. It's called Transformed by Birth by a woman named Britta Bushnell. And it's a guide around preparing for letting go of expectations. And that's not necessarily saying letting go of your hopes for your birth.
That's right.
Right? Like you want to try and set yourself up for the birth that you want. However, a big part of the process is letting go. I mean, it is the process. It
absolutely is the process.
On every level, whether that's like physically letting go, muscularly, emotionally.
Yes.
And so, you can have a vision, but then it's like, how can you also be versatile and adaptable and resilient in your mind, so that when something happens that you weren't expecting, like your labor stalls all of a sudden, or your water breaks and you don't go into labor for an extra day,
that doesn't totally throw you completely. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
It is. It's a hard thing as a midwife to I was just reflecting on that a little while ago. It's a really difficult thing as a midwife to have those discussions sometimes, because there are some people who have a certain, like, this is how I want it to go. No, I'm definitely not okay with an epidural, or, certain things that they're very strongly have feelings about. And I always want to honor those, because that's her preferences, right? Or her family's preferences. But at the same time, I also want to discuss, okay, birth is uncertain. So what if this were to happen? Right. What do you want if that were to happen? What are your preferences in that circumstance? So I do try to encourage families to think about, okay, what if it doesn't go that way? Yeah. Then think about, what are your options and what are your preferences in that situation? And some people are really resistant to that. Yeah. And that can be hard, because I never want to pass on any fear or judgment or anything like that to any of my clients. But I think it's a really important thought process, or kind of thinking through, okay, what if my journey took a different turn,
and would I be okay?
How
could I be okay?
Exactly. How can I I think that's the keys. How can I? And that's, like you said, that sort of emotional work, mental work beforehand, because in the moment it's harder to adapt your brain to what's going on, right? But if you sort of thought about it and prepared in your mind, okay, if this does happen, I'm going to be okay because of these things, or,
And you're not saying you want it, right? And no, it's just saying, and it is important, because the rigidity, and this can be applied, I think, to all facets of life, but the rigidity around things, and feeling like the need to control when we don't have the control, that's when it becomes traumatic, or that's when it becomes really difficult and super disappointing, when you become so fixated on a certain outcome or an idea that you're going to control a situation.
That's right.
And that is, that is the work, I think, the true emotional, spiritual, and physical work of birth. And it's, I think about now moving into my second birth, And having had one is letting go the expectations of the first birth. Right. So I'm not in the clear. And that's important work for me because I visualize my birth. I visualize it happening so similar to how it happened with Joni.
Right.
I could not get to the pool this time. You know, there's so many different things that could happen. It's like, how can I feel okay in myself, regardless of how that's going to happen?
Yeah, for sure. And part of that too, you know, is having really good support.
Yes.
I remember having a discussion when I was doing my training in Ireland. I went to a birthing center in Scotland, the most gorgeous place to ever give birth. It looks out, they have their birthing suite, it kind of looks out over the sea.
Oh gosh.
It's just stunning. Yeah. So I was having this conversation with one of the midwives there, very experienced midwife, and about my frustrations in Ireland, just without, you know, not having that continuity of care, having a very much more medical, I suppose, medical perspective of birthing and pregnancy overall. And we had a really good conversation. And one of the things that has always stuck with me is she said, you know, Lee, like we can't control, we can control to a point how people, you know, the outcomes for people. But we really ultimately cannot control what happens, like that uncertainty piece. But if we can provide that support and that care for somebody in those situations, then we've really done our job as midwives, right? Is to really be there for people in all the aspects, you know, physically, with information, involving them in decisions, supporting them, providing emotional support. Like those things are so key in those moments of uncertainty and you know, change from what you expect.
And would you say that's one of the bigger differences between the midwifery model and the medical model?
Yeah, for sure.
I think so too.
Well, it's all about that relationship, right? Like you were saying, like, you know, appointments with the midwife are, you know, 45 minutes, you know, an hour, 45 minutes. So you have time to discuss, you have time to have those conversations of what's important to you. And we know how you're doing kind of emotionally a lot of the time. So we have those conversations. Whereas when you're in and out of a quick, literally like checking on your baby appointment, that's very difficult to feel supported in those situations. I mean, certainly, yes, information giving is always, I have to say, like our physicians are excellent at that, giving that information to people when they're birthing. I don't know that it's the same though.
No, it's not the same.
You're getting information, but not necessarily a relationship.
And emotional care.
Emotional care, yeah.
Like I think about even just you showing up at the house and checking how dilated I was, right? And you're coming, yes, you're doing a very medical thing. You're checking on baby, you're checking on me.
Yes.
But at the same time, you're like, it's okay. You're doing well. This is normal.
Yeah.
You know, how are you doing?
Yes.
Emotionally, like you're checking in on all that stuff. It's not just like I'm showing up at the clinic. Quick. And
let's quick check and then you're gone. Yeah. No. Yeah. And I know, I mean, that's not easy, I'm sure, for physicians either.
No.
You know, they definitely are trying to create, within their models, create some kind of relationship building, but it's
just
hard.
The model itself.
It's exactly that. It's the model itself.
It's not the physicians per se.
Yeah.
And and this is where midwifery is so outside of that model, especially it seems like in Canada. Is there a country that has an even more progressive approach with midwifery?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I would say probably some of the European countries.
Yeah. Would they have like their own centers and?
Yes. Oh yeah. And England as well. I mean, everybody who births in England would have a midwife. And they have various models where in Ireland, it was all in the hospitals with midwives. England, or UK, I should say, they have like independent midwives. They have birthing centers. They have units that are attached to a hospital, but that are like a midwifery-led unit, but attached to the hospital if intervention was needed.
So it's a little bit more integrated in that way?
Or a little bit more a few more options, I would say.
Okay.
I would say we're quite integrated with our healthcare system, which is one of the reasons why it can be a really safe option to have a midwife and home birth.
Yeah.
We have good relationships with, if we did need to transfer, we have good relationships with our hospitals and with our other healthcare professionals for the most part.
And you have people that birth in the hospital?
Yes. Yeah.
Often.
Yeah.
But I mean, we were talking about this before, and I think it's an important point. It's that while it might be integrated, you know, you guys are still like contractors to healthcare, right? So it's not like, are doctors contractors? I don't think they.
I'm not sure.
Maybe if they have a private practice. But if you work in the hospital, you're...
I'm not entirely sure how their model works in that regard.
But for you guys, you can bill the government.
So we can bill the government for any care that we provide for midwives, but we're essentially private practice.
Self-employed.
Oh, self-employed, yes.
Basically.
Yeah.
Right, and we were talking about that because yesterday I was talking to Julie, who's also my doula, about this, and she had said that midwives are leaving the profession like 5 times more now. And I can't prove that right now because it's just like what Julie said. But basically, underlying thing is like we are in dire need of midwives and they're overworked.
That's right.
And underpaid.
Underpaid, yes. Undervalued, really.
Undervalued.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, thankfully here in Kamloops, I do feel like we have some really good relationships with our colleagues, but that's not always the case. That's not always the case. And so midwives aren't always trusted in their care by other healthcare professionals, which then affects their autonomy and how they practice, right?
I bet.
And we certainly come up against that, you know, in various aspects of our care here as well. We have those hard conversations. Joanna Norman, who started midwifery here in Kamloops, is a great advocate for midwifery-led care here and has done a lot of work.
The groundwork.
Has done a lot of groundwork towards that. So we certainly benefit from that groundwork here in Kamloops for sure. Yeah.
Well, I think about, because when I had you last time, you were at a different practice and you were my midwife. So it was like I only saw you. And I think I saw someone else postpartum, which was just part of, you know, what has to happen because you do have to take a day off.
We do.
But the thing that I couldn't wrap my head around is just how much you guys have to work and, you know, like the on-call piece. And I know that you've moved to a different model now in your practice with Sage Hill's midwifery. And it's now the 3 of you working together.
Yeah. So it's more of a team model, which actually is how most midwifery is in the Lower Mainland.
Okay.
So you do a team model where a small enough team where we're able to kind of meet everybody and get to know everybody, but still have days off, which is always good.
Yeah.
scheduled days off and good coverage.
It's so important because I think about, you know, you've talked a lot about how midwifery care is so reliant on relationship, right? And as a counselor, like I know what that requires energetically, and I know that even on top of that you guys are like staying up all night often and you're doing medical care, so it's not just relationship.
That's right.
You know, the work that you guys do is so diverse and it pulls on so many different pieces of you, you know, intellectually, emotionally, physically. Like your job can be physically demanding, you know, when you're at births for hours.
Yes. Wake up the next day and like, what position did I get my body into? I'm not really sure.
What was I doing last night?
How did I catch that baby?
With even just like, you know, like monitoring a fetus.
Yes.
Like with the Doppler during a birth. Like, you know, I would think about Ace was at my birth last time and she's like, in there, I'm in the pool, and you're just
we're kind of twisting.
You're twisting, but you're doing that sometimes for a very long time. So there's a lot. You guys give a lot, to your clients.
Yeah. So there's definitely, you know, a burnout happening, and we're seeing a lot of midwives leaving the practice, and you know, practices closing, like in Penticton now. The practice there closed. Yeah.
Oh, that's
very sad. Yeah. Very disappointing for those women in that community. Yeah.
It is really disappointing.
Yeah.
As a woman
to not have that choice, right?
Yeah, and I remember with Joni, I was, because I thought my due date was different before one of the ultrasounds. So then I was told I couldn't have midwifery care.
Oh,
and then I was devastated. Like it was because there was too many people birthing at the same time as me, which is like. fair enough.
It happens. Yeah.
It happens. And so as a woman, when that choice is not even available, it really sucks.
I know. And we find it hard. Like the number of applicants we get are far and above what we can take.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because obviously to protect our model of care, we do have sort of a lower caseload of clients than say like the maternity clinic. Like
yes.
we definitely can't take those numbers in order to provide the care that we do.
Yeah, you can't.
So it's very hard to pick who to take, right? Like sometimes it's just very difficult because we have to sort of pick only a few for that particular month. Yeah. Depending on, our numbers for that month.
Well, you risk the care, right?
And but there's lots of people that don't get midwifery care. And it's really unfortunate. We would love to take everybody because I think everybody should have that option.
Yes.
So we definitely need more midwives in this community and generally in this province. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you think about, do you think that's one of the biggest challenges right now with midwifery care is the lack of midwives?
Lack of midwives, but also lack of value and support of midwives. Like we don't, because we're private practitioners, we don't have any like sick leave or
maternity
leave. There's no maternity leave. Yeah. There's just there's very little support for midwives, and we're certainly appealing to the government for things like that right now.
Are you?
Yeah, our association is. So
yeah, that's
you can support us as much as you can to ask the government to really value us as practitioners.
Do you guys have a campaign going right now?
There has been a campaign. I haven't seen anything lately, but there was certainly a campaign through the Midwives Association of BC fairly recently, just trying to appeal to the government because we're back in negotiations at the moment, trying to get a better deal for us.
That's good.
Better care. Yeah.
Well, and I think about, and I know you mentioned this before we got on microphone, but when we think about women's health, it just feels like it's another example of how women's health is undervalued.
It is totally undervalued. It takes a backseat in so many ways, and we definitely see that in the provision of, or like the value of midwifery care, because we know that midwifery-led care is very women-centered.
Yes.
Right? And that's the whole purpose of midwifery-led care, is to be women-centered.
And it's undervalued.
It's undervalued, yeah.
It's underpaid.
Yeah.
And there's still, and we've dipped in and out of mentioning this, but there's still a stigma around it. I mean, like historically, midwives were witches.
Yes, yeah.
It's like still seen by some people, even if it's not verbalized.
Burn the witches.
Yeah. Or like, shamanism or these things, these healer things, which were really valuable at that time. But there's still this underlying
the perspective of them. Yes. Yeah.
This underlying idea that midwifery is alternative.
Yes.
It's alternative care, right? That somehow
absolutely.
When it's not, like, what makes it alternative, right? And what is and it's alternative maybe because it is not what has been the norm for the last how many years, but it's actually been the norm for, if we were to
centuries and centuries.
That's right.
Yes. Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, it's not alternative.
It's really
the norm.
And, when, we were talking about the research on midwifery-led care earlier, like when you look at that, midwifery care is essential.
Yes.
Essential for women's health and for newborns' health and fetal health. Like it's really essential. It's not alternative.
No. It's not. And I know I keep saying this, but that I look at the mental, the emotional and mental health of women and mothers, like it's a serious problem.
It is a problem. And therefore the community as a whole.
And the ability to parent. And a lot of times there's been correlations between what's happened in birth and what's happening postpartum with like postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. It's often linked.
Oh, absolutely is linked. Yes,
it's linked.
Definitely.
And so when women aren't getting the support that they need during pregnancy and birth, we're seeing longer term impacts on their mental health. And therefore, there's impacts on families and communities.
And we know as well that, women who are struggling with anxiety and depression in the pregnancy as well as postpartum, that affects their like the fetus in utero.
Yes.
Just hormonally, it can affect the fetal brain development. And then afterwards as well, like you said, like the community of their family, especially if the other partner is also depressed or has anxiety,
yes,
that's going to affect the children growing up. And
you can imagine not having supportive care while you have that, right?
Yes.
While you're managing anxiety or OCD or depression, and then not having the type of care where you're feeling empowered.
That's right.
And then you're going into a birth and you're not feeling safe. I mean, it compounds and we really see the impact. And, then there's also not a lot of support for mental health. So then it's just a perfect storm sometimes.
It keeps us, that's right. It's a tough one for sure. And certainly in these times of the pandemic, we're seeing that even more so than we ever have before.
Like the anxiety?
So much anxiety and depression and people struggling with their mood. It just seems to be exponentially higher than it ever has been before. And like you said, very little support for that.
Yes.
Which is it's tough. Yeah.
Well, I think about the necessity as a pregnant woman and as a early or new mom for community. I mean, you talk about communities birthing babies before, like midwives living in community.
Yes.
It is a time in which I think we have a deep primal need for support and connection.
Yes.
So being pregnant during a pandemic, during COVID, and not having the ability to see your family for some people, not being able to connect with their friends, not like, it's just, of course, it's going to impact our mental health.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. And we talk about it a little bit, but we don't talk about it enough.
We really don't. And we sort of almost normalized it, but really not recognizing the impact that it's actually truly having on our mental health and our families. And there's a study that I found quite interesting. I can't remember when it was. I think Dr. Herxma. I could be, don't quote me on that. I'm not sure if that's right. But she did a study where she looked at the brain of pregnant mothers and then postpartum as well, looked at their brains. And their gray matter actually significantly decreases. And the way it was kind of described, it's almost like a pruning, like a synaptic pruning. So, we always talk about, pregnancy brain or postpartum brain, breastfeeding brain. This actually seems to be a thing where the brain actually seems to adapt. So, have kind of prunes these synapses. So kind of breaks some connections where you maybe forget daily things that don't really matter, and maybe start to build more connection to other people, have more empathy, more for bonding with your baby or with community around you. Wow. So, you just think of it like biologically and physically, that's happening as well. And when we're not having those connections with others, how does that affect everybody involved?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And the feeling of safety.
Yes.
Not only just the connection for these, primal needs of preparing for baby and feeling support, but that's that safety piece and just, like knowing that people have your back.
Yes. Totally.
To put it simply, it's such a huge transition.
And who are experiencing the same thing, that this is, again, that normalizing.
That's right.
Okay, this is a normal part of becoming a parent. This is a normal part of a changing family, and having those connections for that.
I think about postpartum and how I went to a yoga class once a week. And the thing that I gained from that experience was not the yoga.
Right.
It was all the other mothers.
Connection, yeah.
And it was the babies and everyone else showing up all dirty and tired and
like, okay, I'm okay.
I'm okay. And then being able to have conversation with them and having community. And then I think about new moms that have come out and new families that have come out in the pandemic and how they haven't had that opportunity.
That's right.
For community. And it's really, it's a concern of mine. And I think about it because I see it happen with people, not just with pregnant people, right? In my practice. And I mean, right now in Kamloops, there's wait lists at every single
I know
mental health.
It's so difficult for us as practitioners, like to be able to refer people because it's either private pay or it's a really long wait list. At the public mental health. And
even private pay, we're talking about 2 months to 3 months wait list. People aren't getting in,
That's crazy.
And I'm getting calls for clients for me to take them on 2 to 3 clients a week still. And I'm on maternity leave.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it speaks to the impact that this pandemic is having on mental health. And I think we're scared to talk about that because it feels like if we say that there's an impact on mental health, that we don't believe in COVID, or that, these two things can't exist at the same time. Right. But they do. And they are existing.
Exactly. And they are affecting people. Yeah. And their mental health.
Yeah,
I think connection is so key for us as humans, let alone pregnant humans, right? Like just as humans, it's so important for us to connect with others and have conversations and commune, like be in community. It's such a key part.
Well, it's the one thing that's consistent across every culture. It's happened since we've been, it is an absolute need. And this is my hopeful self, but I just hope that we can become more intentional about that.
Yes.
Moving out of this pandemic and really see how important our communities are
and
to us.
Not forget how bad it was, or how, impactful it was to not have that.
Yes. When we couldn't hug each other, when we couldn't dance together, when we couldn't have suppers with our friends, when we couldn't go to community events together. Like these things are so important.
So important.
And they're woven within the tapestry of what it means to be human. And not being able to access that has had a really big impact on people and people differently, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been with people doing work this whole time as you have.
Right.
I've had those needs met in other ways,
yes.
Because I'm seeing people every day, but if I was not in this job, I would not be well.
Yeah. I mean, I personally am a bit more of an introvert anyway, so I'm quite happy to just hang out at home or, read a book or whatever. But even myself, like I see people very frequently, but that connection is not it's not the same.
No.
Right? The connection with people that are close to me outside of work, that's suffering.
Yeah.
It's not easy to maintain that when you're not like able to be with them and hang out and do daily things, right?
Yeah, and not be the practitioner, right?
Yes,
so it's one thing to get some of those needs met, but it's definitely not the same.
Not the same. Yeah.
Is your family in Kamloops?
My husband's parents are.
Okay. And where's your family?
My family are all over the world.
Are they?
Yeah. My dad's in England, and my grandpa, like his side of the family, are all in England, north of England. And my brothers are both in South Africa with their families. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you grew up in Zimbabwe until the age of?
I was 17 or 18.
Wow. So like the most
17. Yeah. And then I came to Canada. Yeah, I know. So I've lived more of my life here than I ever did in Zimbabwe, which is bizarre because I feel like I connect more with my African roots, but
yeah, well, it's the formative years, right?
Yes, true.
So, 0 to 17, like that's true. When your brain's developing and your experiences are kind of the first.
Yeah.
So that's I remember thinking when I looked you up before when I was looking for a midwife. Thinking, oh, she's from Africa too, because Tim's
that's right.
Grew up
from
in South Africa.
Yeah. When did he leave South Africa?
He came to Canada, I think. Oh goodness. I don't even know. Test me. Well, he kind of bumped back and forth. So he came here, I think in 2012 to Toronto for some time. And then he went back to South Africa. Then he came back and forth tree planting in the summer times.
Okay, yes.
And then when we had met on one of his summers tree planting.
Oh.
And then he went back to South Africa and then we had to make the decision, like, are you going to move here more permanently?
Is this real or...
Yeah, are we going to take this risk?
Do this?
And he did.
And
now we have a baby and another one coming.
That's awesome. What a great story.
So he just bumped back and forth, but he did try living in Markham for a period of time, working, and then he just found that, like, okay, if I tree plant and go back and forth, I think that it'll be more financially viable for me. And, as a musician, he just felt like that was more fun for him, I think. But yeah, that was always a big draw when I saw your profile. I'm like, oh yeah, someone else from Africa. Yeah. So I just want to check my questions.
Sure.
Wow, I feel like we covered a lot of it. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, so you guys have been open in your new clinic now. Is this year 2 or year 3?
Not quite. September will be 2 years. So September last year was the first year.
That's amazing. And so are you noticing a difference in the model of care for you as a midwife?
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. It's much more manageable. It's much more of a balance for a work-life balance. Because when you're on your own as a midwife, you're always on call, like 24/7, unless you're on your holidays. And that's hard. That can be hard. So you're doing call and clinic. And so this way we have scheduled days off. We have sort of a rotating schedule between the three of us.
Yeah.
And also I really enjoy my colleagues. So that helps as well. They're very, fairly similar.
Yeah, they're lovely.
And they are. So I'm very grateful for that we connect really well. I feel like we care for our clients fairly similarly, which helps. Yeah, I've been, having been a client previously and then now a client of the shared model, is I do appreciate it. I mean, as much as I'm like, I want Lee. I know. I want to be at your birth.
I'm like, Lee's going to be at my birth.
That's right. I'm just putting that out there too. Like, I will be here.
Well, we have Monday, right? Monday, you're back in.
Yes.
I've been holding
but I'm ready to come anyways, even if I'm on holiday.
But other than that attachment, which we've talked about, I've really enjoyed actually having more women involved. I think about even my first birth, having, my best friend and my doula, and then the two midwives. And I hadn't met Ace before she came to my birth. Right. And so what I know now for sure is that I will have met all of the midwives.
That's right.
Right. So she's second and I had never met her.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is, that is maybe a risk of the other model.
That's right. And that can happen sometimes it can happen even with our model, but it's just less likely because for second intending, it could be, we have other people that you may have not met.
Oh, really?
But we do try to second for each other if we can, just because we know our clients, right? And it's a pleasure for us to do that if we can.
Oh, I bet. I mean, it's like, it's like you're preparing or you're working with this client all the way. It's like, you want to get to the birth.
Absolutely. I want to see this prize.
You're like, let's go.
I have to say that's maybe the one thing, if you've been at a labor with somebody for a long time, and then there's sort of that changeover, we change over at 9:00 in the morning. So if there's a changeover and I know that, this person's probably not going to birth until, sort of later in the day, then I really responsibly should hand it off to one of my colleagues. And it's really hard because I'm like, no, I've done all this work with this woman. I really want to stay here.
You're like, can you call me when you think it's going to be about 30 minutes?
Exactly. Can I come when it's nearly there?
I bet that would be hard.
It's hard. Yeah.
That would be really hard.
That part is hard. Or with repeat clients, like, the possibility that I may not be at your birth is very sad to me.
I know.
Yeah.
I know, but I don't think it's going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
We've been like, yes.
Denial, right?
All right, but I'm letting go of expectations. I'm like, my only expectation is Lee's going to be there. Oh, wait. Okay, no.
Wait a second.
No, I've talked with both the other two midwives and they're like, we both want to be at your birth. And
I know.
I'm so honored.
Yeah. And this is, we have this, certainly for home births as well. Mm-hmm. We all want to be there. There's certain births that we're like, we all want to be there. And that's such a great feeling.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And I think that also speaks to those that are listening. Like, if all of you want to be at a home birth, I know you guys give everyone choices, but it's like when home births are so special, or like when, it just shows you that birth can be such a beautiful, powerful experience, not something that's fearful and, that we need, tons of intervention and stuff for. So. Yeah, I'm endlessly grateful for midwifery care.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I'm so glad.
I really am.
I mean, obviously I'm biased as a midwife, but I mean, beyond the fact that I am a midwife, I wish that all women who wanted midwifery care could get it. Yeah. If I could change anything in BC, that would be, or in Canada or anywhere, that's what I would change. Well, that everybody who wants one would get one. Yeah. Yeah.
I wish that too.
Yeah.
I've often thought about, if I wasn't a counselor, I would have been a midwife.
You make a great midwife.
I would love to be a midwife. After having my birth, I just there was something that sparked in me. And now I just work with women, not just women.
Which is very important as well. It's such important work.
But I want to be at the births.
Yeah. I know. That's
like a drug.
It's a great part. I know. Births are amazing. I mean, it's not only about the births, but we do really like the births.
They're amazing.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. And so I'm just like gonna weasel my way into as many births as possible in my life is my hope.
And that's it. It's like, I think that whole, like having your best friend there, for example, like, that's how we're going to start kind of including people from our communities in birth, so that they see birth a normal births, and pass that on. Oh, I had this experience. And I just feel like those stories are necessary.
They are
really necessary.
And even having kids at birth, like whether they can handle it, but that's like, this is how we change the culture. And, and just, like we, with Joni, cause we don't know whether she's going to be here or not. We've been watching, birth videos with her.
Lovely, yeah.
And but even in the birth videos, seeing women who have their 3 kids there, or in a birthing room, there's like 6 people, and you're like, wow, that's amazing. I mean, I would probably be locked in the bathroom personally as the birthing woman.
I was just going to say, it really depends on the birthing person, right? Yeah.
I was like quite private, at least last time in the beginning, but having people just in your vicinity. And so this time, I'm going to have a friend here for Joni. A different friend, and Julie, and midwives, and Tim, and if it wasn't COVID, we were hoping to have my sister here as well.
Right.
But I am a firm believer in that now. How can we, as long as it's okay for the birthing women, and people are versatile and adaptable, that if they're asked to leave, they leave.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And they can respect the birthing space. But yeah, more exposure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And those good stories too, right? Or even like stories that maybe don't go to plan, but how women were resilient through that, how they made it through that, how they sort of reframe those experiences.
Yes, I think that's really important.
Yeah,
and that's one of the pieces at this book that I already talked about, Transformed by Birth, is she talks about, in birth, you will have to go to the depths of yourself. Or you should expect that. Right?
I say that to my clients all the time.
Yes.
This experience will likely take you to the very bottom.
It will.
It will. It forces you there whether you want to go or not.
Right.
Yeah.
So you either go willingly or,
or you
tooth
fight
and nail
all the way.
Or you run away from the toilet.
That's right. And not in a bad way either. I want to clarify, like, to the depths of yourself, like where the root of you is.
That's right.
Like your strength and your power and beauty.
Yeah. And you get to pull it up, and you get to say, and so how can you take your experience and reframe it, or see like how you actually were really resilient. And when I do that trauma work with women around their birth, it's, I ask them like, well, what did you do? How, and a really good question is, how did your birth change you?
Yes.
How did it change you?
Yeah.
Because it did change you.
Yeah.
There's no way in hell it didn't.
That's right. Exactly.
And so seeing that there was a transformation of sorts, even if that transformation didn't come in the package that you were hoping, there was something. And we all get ours,
That's
whether
right.
you're going to, your challenge, what I mean, and whether that's going to be a challenging pregnancy where you've been really sick, or you had a really challenging birth, or you had a challenging postpartum. There's always a part of this journey that's going to really ask you to trust yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And even, because we are seeing, there is trauma around birth. We see that quite often. Like, we'll sometimes get people in that have had a very traumatic first birth. And I always get quite, I wouldn't say excited, but I love that, because I'm like, okay, I get a chance to help this person redeem that, I think maybe is the word. Redeem. I don't know if that's a good word to use, but and maybe I can be part of that journey, and that would be amazing if I could, right? I always think that,
and I'm sure sometimes you are,
and hopefully I am.
Yes.
Where was I going with this?
That birth can be traumatic.
Yes, it can be traumatic, but even in the processing of that traumatic birth, like with you in counseling, like, yes, that may be your experience, but then you grow in this way because you've had to deal with that.
That's right.
Pain and that trauma. And now you're here and you've grown, right? So there's always, like you say, there's always some growth and some change, positive change that can come out of it.
And can you see it, right? And how can you see
can you let it come?
That's right. And can you see your resiliency in the face of some of that challenge? And I mean, when I already said my perspective, but when you think about birth as a traumatic experience, I mean, for you, what do you think makes birth a traumatic experience?
It's hard to pinpoint that, to be honest. I always thought it was, the traumatic kind of births that I would look at and go, oh, that was a lot, maybe an assisted birth, or emergency stressful environment. But I've certainly had experiences with clients who have had, to me, what was such a lovely, normal, straightforward birth, and they've experienced it as a traumatic event.
Interesting.
So it's actually really hard for me to sort of say what is traumatic.
It's probably the best answer.
It's each person.
It is
their experience of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that just speaks to exactly what you were speaking to a minute ago about how I don't want to say it's about perspective, because it's not necessarily, perspective sounds shallow, but it's like how you experience yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You could have what would be from the outside a home birth that was really natural and beautiful, and someone can see that as being a traumatic event.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, I've had people where I've thought, oh man, they're going to have to deal with some stuff. And they just have had great things to say about their birth, so positive. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. They felt supported through that. They didn't, the trauma just wasn't there for them. And certainly there's situations where maybe that's denied in a bit of denial, but I've seen it where it looks real to me, like that they just have not experienced it as a trauma, but were supported enough through it that they actually thought it was an amazing birth experience. Which is awesome.
Which is
always great.
That is great. And it speaks, it really, I think, highlights the importance that we don't, see all medical births as traumatic, or we see all C-sections as traumatic, or we see all home births as not traumatic. And
correct.
This is sometimes what happens, especially in certain communities around like natural birthing communities. And even though the intention is to actually like make birth natural for women, which is very important, as we've talked about throughout this whole podcast, but this like boxing of, this is a traumatic birth and this is not a traumatic birth is not helpful.
No.
Because there's a lot of shame for some women when they don't get to have a vaginal birth.
Right.
For various reasons. And then they feel like it should be traumatic because of that, or that they did something wrong because they couldn't have the natural birth, or whatever it is. Yeah. So it's not a cookie cutter.
It's really not.
No.
And I think it's partly why I love my job so much, is nothing's cookie cutter. I mean, sometimes I wish it was. I wish we could say, okay, we're going to plan your birth on this particular day at this particular time, If we could do that, that'd be amazing. But
some OBs can.
Some OBs can, yes. Or, family doctors. Won't say that, but it's true though.
It is true. Yeah. No, it's totally true.
But generally birth is just not predictable.
No, so you get to just fly by the seat of your pants all
the time. Kind of. I mean, obviously we'd do risk assessments and kind of, we know who's more at risk for certain things and plan for that. But overall, it's different every time. Yeah.
That's so cool. I can just imagine how amazing that is. And also, just such an adventure for you guys.
Yeah, an adventure. That's a good word, because, sometimes it's not amazing. Sometimes it's like, oh man, I wish I could predict this. I keep, sort of do what I wanted to do. But
I'm sure though you have ideas of like, certain women labor certain ways. Like you can start to have wider boxes of like,
yes,
I can imagine this is going to go this way.
Yes.
Like I remember you saying, when women have this experience, they often have a really fast labor. Right. Or not really fast, but like a faster labor.
Yes.
And so it's like, I'm sure over time, as you practice, you start to have ideas of maybe they're not small boxes, they're bigger boxes of like, okay, so I can imagine this birth is going to work out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've certainly been surprised too. Like, there's some situations where I think, I think she might have a longer labor and definitely will need some pain management. And, I think we all make judgments all the time.
Of course.
Right? And whether we sort of act on those or not, it's hard to know. But there's certainly people that I would put in that kind of a box, and then their resiliency comes out.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I'm like, I was wrong, and I'm so glad I was wrong.
Yeah.
About that particular situation.
And that's just learning, that's just learning for you too. And I think about that. I can relate to that in the counseling room when you're like, oh, I don't think that person's going to have that conversation, with their partner, because it's too scary. Then they come back and they're like, I did. And you're like, whoa, I'm so,
so
that's
proud.
amazing.
It's amazing. Yeah.
No, it's so good. Yeah. Well, Lee, I'm so excited for my birth.
I'm so excited too.
Yeah. And as you know, we said this morning, I have to get more uncomfortable before that happens.
That's right. You look too lovely and comfortable today.
I know. I was feeling quite uncomfortable a couple weeks ago when I ended work, and I was like, man, this baby might come early. And then the other day I walked downtown. It was like a 25-minute walk with a backpack on. And as I got downtown, I thought, oh shit, I'm not having this baby for at least a couple more weeks. I'm like, there's no way that I would be able to do a 30-minute walk with a backpack.
Right.
If I was going into labor.
If you were going into labor, probably not.
Probably not. Who knows?
Yeah,
but I know my body enough to know that I think I need to get a little bit more.
You probably sense something deeper than that even. Yeah.
So we have time, and I'm glad you're going to be back on call.
Because I'll be back on call. More of a chance. Although I was in some ways hoping it would be while I was on holiday, because then I would for sure be able to be here.
Oh, right. Because you could be like, I'm just going to come in.
I'm going to come in second.
Do you hear that, baby? It's so funny. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, such a pleasure. Always, Deandra. Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And I know that our listeners are going to be so happy to have heard the perspective of a midwife and around midwifery care, because as women, we're just like trying to get as much of that information as possible.
Yeah. And if anybody does want more information on midwifery care or midwifery-led care, I'm very happy to provide some resources. So you're welcome to connect them to me.
Okay. And so that's Sage Hill's Midwifery in Kamloops.
Yes. Sage Hill's Community Midwives.
Yes. Thank you. And you guys do have social media, don't you?
We do.
Oh, who manages that?
Not I.
No, you guys don't have enough. I was going to say, like, you're not going to find these women like pumping their Instagram and
I
Facebook.
See what you're saying. No.
They are too busy
we
delivering
do it when
babies.
We can, kind of thing. Yes, exactly.
So if you want some more information, there's also the BC Association of Midwives.
So you probably find more information on the Midwifery Association of BC. Okay. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's what you were saying.
That's the better way of saying it.
Yeah.
So I'll link that in the show notes, and I'll also put your clinic.
Yeah.
And
there's also Mighty Oak Midwifery. Yeah, Mighty Oak Midwives.
Yeah, you're like, spread it out, because we both have to take women.
Yeah, well, this is it. We always say, like, apply both, because if you get in with a midwife, perfect.
Yeah, you're lucky.
Yeah. And hang on to that midwife.
Yes, and do. Yeah. And, there's some other, I'm sure there's lots of resources out there, but if anything I want to say, or the one thing I want to say is, let's just continue this conversation, all of us, around birth and healthcare and women's health, because it's a really important conversation.
And tell your stories, the positive ones, and how you made it through the hard ones too. Tell the stories.
Yeah, that's important. Thanks.
Support each other. You're welcome.
Awesome.